Breaking down Texas A&M football, we've got Andrew Hattersley on the line from Gig'em 247 Sports, right here at the Voice of College Football. Please like the video, share these videos out on social media, and subscribe. Get on over to Gig'em 247. Check out Andrew's work. Andrew, it's been a while. How you doing?
Good, and you? Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of months since we last spoke, but it's been good. Kind of rolling along like we were talking about before the show. The high school football's kind of kicking up as well around the area, so it's been a good couple of months.
Well, it's definitely no news to you to say that Texas A&M would have to lead the list of most disappointing teams for 2022.
Yeah,
So
no question about that.
It's not a situation where, okay, let's say a Brian Kelly, a Billy Napier, fill in the blank, first-year head coach Marcus Freeman, maybe not achieving what some fans would want, but it's a first year versus a fifth year for Jimbo Fisher. How is that being taken among the Aggie faithful?
I think there's a lot of frustration, obviously from the perspective of year five. I think people thought around College Station that by this point they could at least expect 10 wins or somewhere close to 10 wins. Having to win three out of the last four, beginning with this weekend against Florida, just to make a bowl was certainly not where anybody kind of expected to be at this time of the year. And I think there's obviously many levels to frustration, right? But starting with the quarterback play, and obviously Connor Wigman was a big bright spot this past weekend, but just the overall stagnation offensively, not scoring over 24 points against an FBS opponent until this past weekend against Ole Miss. And then just the offense in general is high among the list of frustrations, from the offensive line to many different areas. So I think that's kind of where the frustration starts. On the defensive side of the ball, they've been up and down as well. They've been terrible defending the run at points this year. Obviously, giving up 390 yards against Ole Miss is certainly concerning. And I think the loss to Appalachian State was really where the Heat started to ramp up, kind of stabilize things with a couple wins over Arkansas and Miami. But it's just been rocky from the get-go for the most part. And so I think frustration is certainly high.
Yeah, so depending on who you talk to, and most of these people that make comments on the internet, even if they've got a decent platform, don't know what they're talking about. They're just speculating. But would it be true in your estimation? And obviously there's only a certain number of people that have that power and are in those conversations to be able to truly get to the heart of the issue. But do you think Jimbo Fisher is truly on a hot seat, or there's just absolutely no way that he would be dismissed, or that next year could be some kind of make or break year?
I think the chances of that are very low, because you have to keep in mind the buyout's obviously very, very high. But I think this offseason there's certainly going to be a lot of big conversations, which is where I think the expectation around College Station more leads to. I don't think there's a lot of talk about him being on the hot seat, regardless of the frustration. But I think, talking to people, the two areas that folks kind of mention are, one, fixing the offense. I think that there's been a lot of talk about an offensive coordinator and bringing somebody in who can potentially call plays and bring life to this offense. I think that's been conversation number one. And then conversation number two is kind of looking at the manner in which you acquire talent and adjusting to this new age of college football, whether that's maybe being a little more aggressive in the transfer portal. A&M's only taken two guys out of the transfer portal in Max Johnson and Jameer Johnson over the past couple of years. Does that need to change a little bit? Because this is obviously just when injuries continue to kind of hit, and they've hit the last 2 years, A&M's turned to a lot of younger players. Now, there's certainly been some bright spots and guys that have been in the starting lineup from the beginning, like your Evan Stewart's, Donovan Green's been a factor. Some of the guys along the defensive line. I think Bryce Anderson's certainly been a bright spot, but having to rely on so many young guys at such an early stage, I think those are kind of the two big points of conversation. And then I think there's going to be a deep look at the coaching staff this offseason, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and where they can kind of be better on that front. But the reality of it is, when A&M kind of signed Jimbo Fisher to that extension, the buyout's hefty, and I think you'll see A&M explore other avenues like coaching staff changes before they really go down that road.
Andrew Heddersley's here to talk up the Aggies. So they've got a date with Florida at home coming up this weekend. Both teams not having the kind of seasons as expected, but especially Texas A&M at 3-5, 1-4 in the SEC. Join Andrew on Gig'em247. You see his Twitter handle right there as well. Yeah, you mentioned Connor Weigman. So there's a bright spot. So he is the third quarterback who has received playing time this season, and he steps in, provides a spark, shows off the arm talent. There's been much anticipation for seeing him on the field, and he gets that first real experience, meaningful experience against an SEC opponent, which is not a prime position necessarily for him. And he actually stepped in against South Carolina, correct?
He did. He stepped in at a really tough spot. Obviously, Haynes King kind of got hurt late in that second half, and he had to step in with them trailing late in that game, and kind of a tough spot for him to make a debut. But he got his first start against Ole Miss, and I think for those watching could definitely see a difference in the tempo and the pace and just the way the offense functioned.
Yeah, so there's a big bright spot there moving forward. He's been anticipated for a while now, and he's getting a shot. So for the rest of the season, you mentioned a bowl game. For those people that are looking at the totality of the season, nothing's going to meet expectations regardless of what they do the rest of the season. At the same time, you can look at it as, okay, Connor Weigman's played well. Let's see what we've got the last few games. Reset. Can't do anything about what's happened in the past. Let's look at the final 4 games of the season and see how it turns out. And to your point, if they could win 3 of the final 4, that could be a springboard into the next season. Obviously, more practice from a practical standpoint, more practices, bowl practices. You get another opportunity to play a decent team on a national stage, those sorts of things. But just from a vibe standpoint, attitude standpoint, as a springboard into the next season, just as you mentioned, winning 3 out of 4, getting into a bowl game is a huge step in the right direction for next season.
No doubt. I think you've got to be able to make a bowl game. That's got to be step number one. And whether it's going to be a disappointment, being obviously whether you finish with 6 or 7 wins. I think there's no question about that. I think missing a bowl game is only going to hurt things even more. And I know for fans, whether you play in a bowl game at 6 or 6 or 7-5 might not mean a lot, but you mentioned those extra practices, especially when you've got such a young roster with so many young players, some who missed the first part of the year with injuries. So you get them a chance to get those extra practices and begin to grow. I think it's certainly important. Guys like Marquise Groves Killebrew, who played this past weekend, who got injured his senior year and has been working his way back. Those sorts of practices for a young player like that is certainly important. So from an optics standpoint, from having your players be able to experience going and playing a neutral site game against whoever it might be, I think there's still a lot of value in that. And this team has played a lot of close games, and if you can start finding a way to win some of these games down the stretch, maybe you start to build on that, and then it makes your job easier as well. Because frankly, and this is not just a case for A&M, but it's a case around the country, that you're going to have to re-recruit most of your roster when it comes to the offseason with the way the transfer portal works now, and that transfer portal window. The more you have to be able to sell about the vision and be able to paint that vision for players on your current roster and for talent acquisition, it's going to make your life a little easier if you're at least going to a bowl game.
Yeah, it's no consolation, but you mentioned all the close losses. Mississippi State was the only game that got away early, always playing from behind 2 to 3 scores, but everything else, the Ole Miss game, they were out in front most of the game, had some level of game control, but it was certainly well within reach at 31-28. The rest of the games were 1-score games with the ball in Texas A&M's hand to ultimately win the game.
Yeah.
So it's that close.
It's a thin margin, and it's a thin line. And I think the one positive out of this week, and games where you kind of look back and scratch your head, the Alabama game comes to mind for one. The turnover right before halftime with Haynes King kind of throwing it up and leads to 3 points the other way for Alabama. Those sorts of things have been the mistakes that have cost A&M all year long. You even mentioned that Mississippi State game. You know, A&M had control of that game, and they hadn't necessarily punched it in, but we're moving the ball offensively. Devon Achane, who hasn't made a lot of mistakes all year, fumbles down on the goal line, leads to a score for Mississippi State, and then you have a sack fumble right before half. The blocked field goal leads to a touchdown for Mississippi State, and the pick six, and obviously that game got completely away from them. Obviously, the Appalachian State game couldn't get off the field. The South Carolina game, just one of the worst imaginable starts you could get out to coming out of a bye week, to have an interception, a kick return for a touchdown, a ball go off Haynes King's knee and end up in a defensive lineman's arm. They've just had mistakes all year that have kind of put them behind the eight ball. Against Ole Miss, at least, for the most part, didn't really have a whole lot of mistakes. Obviously, no turnovers from Connor Wigman, which was big, and I don't think an accident as to why they were able to lead for a lot of that game. Just couldn't stop the run, and so that's certainly a positive. But week to week, this team has to be more consistent in some of those details. And Jimbo Fisher talks about it often with executing and making some of those extra plays. But at some point, it has to come to fruition, and I think that's kind of the next step for this team.
Talking Texas A&M, we got Andrew Hattersley on the line from Gig'em 247 Sports. Andrew, so from a recruiting standpoint, have we seen any ramifications from going 3-5 thus far?
Yeah, so on the defensive side of the ball, I think things have still been pretty solid. A&M obviously landed a big surprise commitment from an in-state player in David Hicks, which was huge earlier this fall over Oklahoma. I think a lot of people, even leading up to the day of his commitment, really viewed Oklahoma as the favorite in that recruitment, and then started to get word in the final minutes before he was going to make an announcement that A&M was actually going to be the pick. And so, on the defensive side of the ball, that's a huge land for A&M. They've got two bell cows to lead that class with Anthony Hill and DJ Hicks, and then are recruiting some other guys like Peyton Bowen, who's committed to Notre Dame and will be back there this weekend. Oklahoma, A&M, and Oregon are kind of the three schools continuing to recruit him. They've got several offensive linemen committed, and TJ Shanahan, Chase DeSantis, Nikhil Betrand, and Colton Thomason, and then are battling Florida kind of for that last spot with Caden Jones. I think the notable thing, though, and probably the more concerning thing, is the skill positions on the offensive side of the ball. A&M has watched a lot of guys commit elsewhere. Hakeem Williams committed to Florida State. Still don't have a quarterback committed in this class. They made a run at Austin Novosad, who remains committed to Baylor. Dante Moore, Jaden Rashada, Malachi Nelson they had in for a visit over the summer. Just a lot of guys that they've made runs at, but right now do not have a commitment at quarterback and do not have a commitment at any of the skill positions on offense. And so that's certainly the one key, the one concern. And I think it's hard to generate momentum unless you're showing things on the field, and it kind of, that narrative for the past year or two has always been about concerns about A&M's offense, and so I think this year certainly hasn't helped on that front. I think a lot of kids you talk to, and even talking to kids this past weekend, virtually all of them mentioned the young players on offense, and so I think the young players overall playing on the field. And so I think a lot of kids do see that they're playing a lot of young guys, and recruits sometimes see it differently than fans see it. Fans can be very frustrated about the way the season's going, and rightfully so. Sometimes recruits see it differently, and they see an opportunity to play early. They see an opportunity to see some of these young players grow. And so it's kind of that finding the middle ground there. But I think no doubt there's concerns about offensive the offensive recruiting. They've got one target that's kind of emerged of late, Tayshawn Lyons, battling some schools like Notre Dame, Miami. For him, he's a wide receiver, so that's certainly an opportunity to try to get him on a visit. They're a bit late on that recruitment. Kedrick Riscano is another one. He just decommitted from Michigan State, an in-state running back that's having a huge year in the Houston area. A&M got him in on a visit last weekend, and so can they make a move for him and get him committed as a running back? Ruben Owens and Cedric Baxter are some of the guys that they're continuing to pursue. But I think the big thing is A&M kind of went into this year not panicking necessarily about, or not banking, but not necessarily panicking with a lot of key targets committed elsewhere. But it's certainly difficult to. It's more difficult to flip guys when you're 3-5 and struggling on the field in year 5 than say if they had been putting together the kind of season that they hoped for.
Are there any concerns that David Hicks is going to flip?
I think that's a guy, and with a lot of those top level guys, I think right now the confidence around A&M is pretty confident that he'll stay committed, and he certainly committed when A&M was kind of scuffling on the field, and so he committed right around that Appalachian State Miami game. For him, I think the biggest thing is he's right down the road at Katy Pato. He's got a teammate committed in Damian Sanford. Now Oklahoma just offered him, and you can kind of sense that they're going to try to make a push for both of those guys and get them to visit later this fall. You've got to recruit them until the finish line, and so I think A&M's got to close this next month and a half strong on the recruiting trail. They certainly have distance as a factor there, and playing in their favor, being just an hour or so down the road. And he's got some strong relationships there with Elijah Robinson and the rest of the staff. So he was just on campus this past weekend again when they played Ole Miss. So I think right now they're feeling good about where they stand with him, but still got to recruit. They until they sign on the dotted line on the early signing period. Certainly got to continue to recruit a guy like him and Anthony Hill with Texas still pushing hard for Anthony Hill as well.
Andrew Hattersley, Gig'em 247 Sports. Andrew, we always appreciate talking to you. Always love to hear from you on A&M. And again, stretch drive for A&M to try to get to a bowl game starts with Florida coming up on Saturday. Andrew, have a great weekend. I know you got a ton going on with high school football recruiting and everything else.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.